Monster Professor.
Welcome to the Monster Professor, a show in which we discuss monsters in literature, myth, games, folklore, culture, and beyond. I'm your host, Josh Woods, author, editor, professor, and monster expert. And a cool episode for today, but right before we get into it, just a housekeeping note or two. In my last episode, Halloween 1978, I was attempting off the cuff last minute to ramble on about why I think John Carpenter's original 1978 movie Halloween is phenomenal. And in doing so, without any prep or anything, I created two problems for myself. One is that I realized after I just recorded and then immediately posted the episode that there are about 7 to 10 other points that I wanted to talk about regarding 1978 Halloween, or that others, listeners, have pointed out that, well, why didn't you talk about this and that and this? And like, man, I should have. So perhaps a Halloween 1978 take two is in the future. Another problem I created for myself is that I think I upset fans of Texas Chainsaw Massacre in my clumsy attempts to contrast how different the films are, in my eyes, Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, as if were saying something bad about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I don't remember actually saying anything bad about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It by Tobe Hooper, 1974. It is a phenomenal film, and it very much groundbreaking in many ways. I think perhaps those listeners who were a bit ruffled at listening to my or contrasting the two, kind of picked up on what perhaps a truth I was trying to hide and didn't quite hide well, is that I prefer Halloween over Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I think it's superior in many ways. Perhaps I'm just mixing up my preference with superiority, as I might very well lose an argument with an avid Texas Chainsaw Massacre fan on which film is superior. So perhaps, maybe we can have an episode in which I bring a Texas Team Massacre versus Team Halloween, or Team Ween, I guess, the Leatherface versus the Shape. In fact, there is one person in particular that I think would be really fun to have a debate episode on the two movies. All in good fun, of course. So, with all of that noted, today, I get the privilege of talking with John Kachuba. Now, John Kachuba is an award-winning author of 12 books, numerous articles, short stories, and poems as well. And the one of these books that is directly related to this show is his recent book out of the University of Chicago Press, Shapeshifters, a History, in which he delves into the deep, deep history of shapeshifters, both in myth, in culture, but even in history. And so we dig into that. But he also happens to be author of several ghost hunting books, those books that give you info on specific sites in your state to go or to engage in ghost investigations. Ghost Hunting Illinois, another book, Ghost Hunting Ohio, another book, Ghost Hunters on the Trail of Mediums, Dowsers, Spirit Seekers, and Other Investigators of America's Paranormal World. And he spent lots of time not only talking to those with paranormal experiences, but going on some ghost investigations himself. Though you'll find out he has a slightly different approach to it than some of the folks you see on TV. And in fact, we're going to not only talk about shapeshifters and ghosts in theory and as beings and legend and folklore and literature, but talking about actual encounters people have reported with not only ghosts, but shapeshifters. It's a pretty cool episode, and I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. So without further delay, John Kachuba. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast here on the Monster Professor, John Kachuba.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Found out that you are the author of the book on shapeshifters in history, titled Shapeshifters: A History. And in addition to that book and a whole bunch of other books, you are also an author of books on ghost hunting, even ghost hunting in my state in Illinois, ghost hunting in Ohio, and more than just those two. And so I wonder if in about one episode we can dig into shapeshifters and real life ghost investigations. That might be too big of an order, but we'll try perhaps. I'm kind of curious what got you in down this path to become what we can call perhaps a shape-shifting expert and maybe a ghost investigations expert. How did you end up as that?
That's I get that question very often. I grew up in Connecticut, New England, lived in other parts of New England, and I was always interested. I've always been interested in history. And so when I would study regional history of Connecticut or the New England area, you get the straight history, but then you also get all these wonderful tales, folklore tales. I lived, 20 yards from a 18th century cemetery that was supposedly haunted and all this kind of stuff. So I just always loved those stories, and thought that, there's actually some history behind some of those. Some are complete fabrications, but I was always just taken with them, especially ghost stories. But it wasn't really until, I guess, probably, about 16 years ago when I started writing about them, even though, like I said, I grew up just in love with those kinds of stories. But I started writing about them about 16 years ago, and the response that I got was just very good. I was surprised to find out how many people were interested in ghosts, and also how many people actually believe in it. There was just a poll out. I can't think of who the poll was, but it was just done last year, 2020, and it said that 46% of the American population believes in the existence of ghosts, which is actually up by about 5% from what that poll was a couple of years previous to that. So it's interesting that the belief is actually growing. But so I was always interested in that, and when I started, finding out how well received my stories were in the book was, subsequent books came out after that, and they have all done pretty well. But what I also noticed was that I did a lot of public speaking, and still do, on programs like yours or at libraries, universities, conferences, whatever. And I always give time for, Q&A at the end. And I was struck by how many times people would tell me their own ghost stories, but then would say, well, I had this other experience, and they would go ahead to describe it. And I would think to myself, that doesn't sound like a ghost. It sounds more like sort of a classical shapeshifter of some kind. So I started looking into shapeshifters, and just discovered how universal the shapeshifter character is. You can find shapeshifters in almost every culture around the world, and going back as far as like Neolithic times up to today. And it's not just folklore. You find them in religion, you find them in mythology, you find them in popular culture, but you also find, and I'll put it in quotes, actual interactions or encounters with shapeshifters. People around the world swear they've had those encounters. So I was amazed by that. And I had to write the book. and even so, it was hard for me to think what to leave out, because there was so much material. And I have hundreds of different kinds of shapeshifters in the book, and I could have gotten probably a lot more as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That interest in ghosts, that is what connects to the shapeshifter. And I guess the two weren't that separate until perhaps perhaps the film era is what finally separated them as completely different genres of things. I mean, I guess even for medievals, a vampire or a werewolf who dies becomes a vampire kind of thing, and that I wasn't aware of that statistic, that recent study on how many believe in ghosts, but yeah, it's not that far off from the ones I saw about 10 years ago. It's something like 40 something percent say they do believe in ghosts. And isn't it something like another 20% say they're possible? So more people are open to ghosts
That's
than
right.
not, which is fascinating. I'm really intrigued in some of the real life encounters of shapeshifters, but maybe we should pop back a little bit chronologically. You say shapeshifters show up in even the Neolithic period. I'm curious if you could give us some insight on in what way do you find them in the Neolithic era?
Sure. Well, first of all, I need to probably define how I'm talking about shapeshifters. The standard definition is a person who can transform themselves into an animal, another person, or sometimes even an inanimate object, and then transform themselves back. So that's the standard one, and I use that. But I also talk about what I sort of call them psychological shapeshifters in cases where people believe that they have been transformed into something else. And yet you look at them physically and you can see obviously they have not been, yet they believe it and they act out on that. So going back to Neolithic times, there is a cave in France. They call it Trois Frères, three brothers. And there is a cave painting in there of what looks like a deer standing on its hind legs. And I have that illustration actually in my book, Shapeshifters. But if you look closely at that illustration, what you'll notice is that instead of the deer having 4 hooves, which we would expect from a deer, it looks like there are fingers and toes on this thing. I mean, clearly there are lines indicating some kind of divisions like fingers or toes. And then when you go further up and you look at the face, instead of the eyes being located on the side of the head as you would expect from a deer, they are dead center like ours. And so anthropologists believe that this is a representation of a shaman transforming himself into a deer. So what is that about? Did he really do it? Well, no, probably not. But I think it goes back to some of the ancient sort of hunter ritual magic, where if you can imagine a shaman working with hunters from the tribe or the clan or whatever, and they're going to go out and they're going to hunt deer. So the shaman draws this thing on the wall of the deer. There's probably chanting and whatever else might be involved, but there's also more than possibly the idea of ingesting some natural hallucinogenics from the environment, whether they're magic mushrooms or whatever they might be. But so what you're doing is you're creating basically a trance state where these hunters believe that they have transformed themselves into whatever the animal was they're going after, in this case, a deer. So it makes sense if you're hunting deer and you are a deer, how hard is that, right? I mean, you can run right up to the deer basically and take it because you believe you're a deer. So it's an interesting phenomenon, but like I said, it's certainly not a physical transformation, of course, but there is this idea of a psychological change where people believe that they have transformed themselves. So, like I said, I'm using the term shapeshifters very broadly because I think that is still a shapeshifter. And I also referred back to the berserkers of some of the Icelandic areas, Scandinavian areas back in like maybe the 12th century, I guess. And, these berserkers organized themselves into warrior bands. There was a bear clan and there was a wolf clan. And they would go into battle wearing the pelts and the hides and the head and everything else of these particular animals, believing that they had taken on that persona, that they had become bears or become wolves. And again, in this case, archaeological evidence shows that they definitely did ingest. I think I can't remember the name of the mushroom. I want to say amaranthus or something. I'm not exactly sure that's correct, but a hallucinogenic mushroom. And when they were in battle, they were in this state where they were completely ferocious, acting out as bears and wolves, and they would literally cut down anything in their path, uh, friend or foe. So it got to be to the point where these berserker bands were so dangerous, even to the people that were hiring them as sort of shock troops, that they had to outlaw them because they couldn't control them. When they were in that frenzy, in that trance, they were completely uncontrollable. And once all that wore off, these guys were useless. They would lay around for about a week just trying to recover. And of course, berserkers, I mean, that's where we get our English word of berserk. And going berserk means acting out like a berserker. So they too had that kind of sort of, shapeshifter ability, although totally mentally, totally psychological.
Yeah, that is fascinating and terrifying. I could imagine that you get one of these Norsemen who are famously genetically large anyway, and on a high protein
Right.
diet all winter long, uh, taking hallucinogenic mushrooms, believing themselves to be bears, and then going wild on the battlefield. That would be a terrifying sight. In fact, far more dangerous than having a bear itself on the battlefield, I
That's,
think.
yeah, right. Because the bear's not carrying a sword or an axe, he's just,
Yeah.
yeah.
Now you say your definition is broad, but it sounds quite useful in making some of these distinctions. You say it's someone who has transformed themselves, and I think that clears away a lot of the myths in which people are turned into something by the gods. Like say Ovid's Metamorphoses, it will is full of nothing but shapeshifters, but almost all of them
Right.
either gods or unwilling. But you make those distinctions too. Like you've got the external versus internal shapeshifter, and I think that's useful as well to think through. And in your book, you make this distinction between willing and unwilling as
Mhm.
well. And I think that's a fascinating aspect. And then as you're kind of laying out these categories, it sounds like the berserker and the shaman kind of go through a similar process, or they seem nearly the same category. But I'm curious about your thoughts on what is far and away the most famous of our shapeshifters, which is the werewolf. And that is far and away the most popular monster on the show among guests and listeners is
Oh, yeah.
the werewolf. Um, and as I'm trying to track back the origin of the werewolf in literature, I can't find one. Assuming that we're taking gods out of the picture, I can't find one earlier than Petronius, which should be, I guess, 80-50 or so in the Satyricon. But I don't really know if that's the true origin of werewolves themselves. It might just be in literature. So I'm kind of curious where you think werewolves started, because it must have been something so compelling we have them to this day. What do you think about the origins of the werewolf exactly, and where that fits in these categories?
Well, I agree. Petronius, I think, might be one of the earliest sort of recorded instances, if you want to call it that, of the origin of a werewolf. I could not find anything specific because I was interested about that myself. And all I can come up with is sort of the idea about the fact that the first domesticated animal was essentially a wolf, right? I mean, a canine that we tamed to become dog. But, mankind has always had this interesting, I think, interaction with, and I'm going to go back to, ancient times, sort of the ancestors of our modern dog. The wolves were terrifying. They could kill you. They could, just literally destroy your life. But at the same time, domesticating them, we found a helpmate. We found an animal that is really bonded with humans like no other animal has. And I wonder if somewhere that's not where the werewolf story sort of originates. And this is totally, I'm really spitballing here because I couldn't find anything to back this up. But there is that close relationship between human and dog or human and canine. And so I wonder if maybe there wasn't something about not the transformation, but that relationship actually showing itself up in terms of something that is half human and half wolf, half canine. I don't know. I mean, that's not very helpful because, like I said, I'm just sort of working out my own theories here on this because
Yeah,
I could never, yeah,
it
I
makes
couldn't.
sense, I think, if you mix it a little bit with what you're describing in the Neolithic cave painting. Like these would be animals that were vital to us, so much so that they would, mimicry would be rewarded in success, right? If you start watching the deer close enough that you can act like the deer is, you're going to be that much better of a deer hunter. And perhaps the same goes with the canine with wolves. So maybe there is something, observation and mimicry that leads into shapeshifting. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. Like I said, it doesn't end up with anything recorded that we can point to and say, well, here you go. Here's the first incidents. But I also mentioned a book too, the biblical account from the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, where the king Nebuchadnezzar basically runs afoul of God, and for that is punished, and he's transformed into some kind of an animal. And it's not clear what kind of an animal he is. If you read the Old Testament, it talks about him having his hair sort of being like feathers, but definitely having claws, eating grass, and sort of being, it sounds like it could possibly be a canine of some kind or maybe something else. And that's, going back to the book of Daniel is pretty old too. So there's an instance where that could possibly be a werewolf. We don't really know.
Yeah, and where would you say witches fit in to this history of shapeshifters?
Well, typically witches are just believed to be shapeshifters, that they had that ability. It's just part of being a witch. Um, I write in my book that early on, you mentioned briefly before about Ovid and some of the Greeks and the gods and all. I wrote early on that it seemed like the shape shifting abilities were restricted to the gods. If you look back at those ancient uh, legends from Greek and Roman and even Egyptian myths and everything, I was hard pressed to find humans that had that ability. It seemed that it was always a special ability reserved for their gods. So my theory was that as mankind progressed, as we became more knowledgeable, as technology advanced, some of these old gods basically got clay feet. They weren't valuable anymore. They didn't make any sense anymore to humanity. So what happens then is you have sort of a new class that rises up. Scientists, also more like the alchemists, the astrologers, and if you want to get a little further out, people that are considered sorcerers, and I would put in that category witches, wise women, who for the most part, as we know, a lot of people considered witches were really simply women herbalists and women medics, if you want to call them that, but they were not, they weren't evil people. But these people now had some power reserved to them, basically through their knowledge, their skills, their own technology, if you will. And so I can see where the general population would say, well, there's something superior about these people, and also something a little off in the sense that it can't be natural abilities. These must be supernatural abilities. And if that's the case, then it'll be very easy to simply say, well, and of course they can shapeshift because that's the province of somebody with supernatural abilities. You simply can do that. So I kind of talk about it declining from gods to more humanity, and I would call witches would be in that category for the most part.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because I mean, in some cultures or literature, and I'm thinking in particular as an example, say the Elder Edda or the Poetic Edda, it's not really clear that witches are humans with connections to the other world or magic. They seem to be an entirely different class of being altogether. And then in various other cultures, there seems to be some it's cloudy. Like, are witches even human or not? And so that
That's
does
right.
make sense as a bridge kind of between the divine and the mundane is something that a witch is. Um, I think that's a pretty darn good summary, I think, or a very brief survey of shapeshifters, kind of some of the broad categories and what they can and have been. Now I've got to leap to what you mentioned, which fascinated me. You've talked to people that you think are describing encounters with not ghosts, but indeed shapeshifters, or people are
Right.
claiming actual encounters. And I don't know what any of these are. I'm not sure I've ever heard any. So could you share some of these, or what made you think that what they're describing is an encounter with a shapeshifter rather than a ghost?
Sure. Well, some of it was some of the reports that I have were not firsthand interviews as much as newspaper accounts and things like that I picked up. But I certainly heard people talk about literally seeing something that they thought actually transformed, um, especially when you get into the southwest part of America, where you have like the Navajo, Dene people, the Utes, and other people like that who have a firm belief in a skinwalker, which is basically, again, a shaman who is capable of transforming himself into some kind of animal. And it's typically a coyote or possibly a wolf, something like that. But they're also regarded as murderers, as killers. They're not good people. And so if you invoke a skinwalker to do something on your behalf, which usually means seeking vengeance on somebody, uh, they'll do it. But chances are you'll be the next in line because they don't want it to be known who they were and what they did. So I've heard accounts of people saying, especially like again in the Southwest, like driving along at night along a highway out in the desert, and suddenly seeing some kind of an animal sort of loping along the car. Um, but then looking at it and saying, what is this? I mean, it looks like, well, we'll say maybe a coyote, but very large. It looks more powerful. I mean, it looks like a pretty large animal. And I remember one person said, well, I didn't know what it was. So I just sped up. I think, yeah, I don't know what this is. And she said that the thing stayed with me. I mean, I was basically speeding and this thing was like, a pace with my car. Um, and then saying that at one point it turned off, or I guess it crossed in front of her. Somehow their headlight picked it up. And she said that what she saw was, again, she described it as kind of like a wolf, but she said that the face was something that wasn't animal at all. I mean, she basically said it was like, it had like human qualities. I don't know exactly what more that would be. Um, but, I think of the 18th century beast of Gévaudan in France that killed something like 100 people over a period of about a year and a half in southern France in little villages. And when this thing was finally killed, it was killed by a local hunter named Jean Chastel, and he shot it. And he wrote in his diary his description of the body of this thing that he shot. And again, like that picture of the shaman, he said that the feet had these, he called them, toes, fingers. And again, the face, he said, was not right. It was more like a human face than an animal.
Huh.
So you have stories like this that just, you don't, it's hard to understand what they could be about, really. I personally, just for the record, I don't believe in actual shapeshifters. I mean, I really, I hate to destroy your audience's hopes or anything, but I don't believe that it's possible for a human being to change into an animal and back again. I had enough science in college that I just find that a little bit hard to believe. Um, but nevertheless, there's these stories. I'm trying to think if there's anything from Illinois.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I have no idea whether my listeners, majority or minority or otherwise, necessarily proclaim belief in these things.
Yeah,
But we always like to wonder, well, just in case, what would you say is our best protection if you're like, oh, I don't believe this thing? I guess I'm reminded a little bit of John Landis describing, the tone of American Werewolf in London when he was trying to get it produced. And it was something like you walk out of a scary movie and then you and your buddy are laughing at someone dressed up like a werewolf or vampire in a very cheesy way. And then they
right.
come and rip your throat out. And while you're dying, you never once believe that it's a monster, but it doesn't matter. You're dead, kind of
Yeah,
thing.
right,
So,
right.
so
But there's been so many newspaper accounts though, and even from reputable newspapers like the New York Times, for instance, that ran a story about some kind of a beast that was running around in Uttar Pradesh in India. I think the year was 1996. I mean, fairly recently, and something like 33 children went missing, from villages in this area. And people were saying that they were seeing this large beast. Well, I mean, there are wolves up there and everything else. So you think, well, yeah, they're wolves that just carried off little children, because certainly they could do that with, no problem. A pack of wolves could easily do that. But the New York Times reporter interviewed some of the people up in these villages, and the accounts they were giving were really pretty remarkable. There was a girl they interviewed. She was, I think, like 12 years old. And she said that she saw her little brother, who was like 5 or 6. She said, I saw him carried off by one of these things. Well, when I think of a wolf carrying off something, I'm thinking, from the mouth hanging. She said her description was that it picked my little brother up, threw him over its shoulder, and then ran off on its two hind legs. Well, that's a pretty remarkable wolf. And she even called it a man wolf, not a wolf man, but she called it a man wolf. And they talked to another person who said very much that, he said he saw one of these things too. And he said, the government wants us to say that they're wolves. He said, but we know better. He said, they're not wolves. They are, and he used the same word too, man wolves is what he was calling them. So there are still accounts coming, even today, there are accounts coming from different parts of the world about sightings of these things. In this case, they've all been werewolves, but there's been other kinds of sightings of other shapeshifters as well, besides wolves.
yeah, that story, I hadn't heard that one. That's terrifying, I think, and
Yeah,
uh, and it reminds me some of the Ghost in the Darkness lions. I'm already blanking on where that was. Where these two lions are uncannily intelligent and crafty, and then the among the villagers who are being killed by them, those who are surviving are certain that they're essentially shamans who are angry at them, and you get the skeptical European hunters down there that finally take him out are not so sure that the shaman legend is wrong necessarily, because there is something and about how they move and hunted and killed seemingly for evil glee rather than for food or survival.
yeah.
And I
Well,
don't know.
that Indian story, the Uttar Pradesh, is even more horrific, because what happened was people started accusing each other of being sorcerers and shamans and transforming and killing all these children and making them disappear, whatever. And so what actually happened was vigilante groups actually formed, and they would get people that they said was a sorcerer, and they'd string them up and hang them. And they killed something like 12 people before the Indian government actually sent in troops to put all this stuff down in there. And
Wow.
this is already from the New York Times. I mean, this isn't me making this up. So think of that. Think of what a supposed evil um, real or not, creates real evil among humans that are affected by the story.
Yeah, and that same kind of thing definitely happened with witches just here in America, not too far from where you grew up in Connecticut too.
That's
So,
right. Right.
um, yeah, and I can't help but wondering now that I hear you describe these kinds of different shamanistic shapeshifters. I can't help but wonder. I'm certainly not the first of, whether or not this Sasquatch might just be a shapeshifter. Maybe we can't find him because he's working the general store in town and just goes out there and turns into it in the woods in the evening. Um,
That could be
but
the answer.
I don't know. Do you have any advice for our listeners, since you're the shapeshifter expert, if they find themselves having to fight or defend themselves from a shapeshifter? Is silver enough? Do we even need that? Any
Well,
advice?
it's funny, but that story about Jean Chastel, killing the beast of Gévaudan, um, people were saying that he used silver bullets. Well, that hasn't been verified, but that would be so typical of the stories. Yeah, you need a silver bullet to do it, or with vampires, you need garlic and crucifixes and wooden stakes and whatever. No, I don't really have the advice of what to do if you encounter a shapeshifter. I don't think running is going to be of much value because they'll just change into something you don't recognize and get you that way. So yeah,
Um, well, I guess just keep driving if you see one of those on the highway, like you said, and
just,
just hope for the best if
just
they
ignore it.
encounter you. I'm curious if we could leap into your ghost investigations,
Okay.
and I'm not really even sure what my questions are for you. I'm just kind of curious about which like I know you walk into these kinds of things with a curiosity and a skeptical mind, and I'm curious if there were any any of these sites you went to check out or write about that uh, that I guess, which ones drew your curiosity the most, and which ones do you think were shaking you up a bit, or maybe even if you've come across any answers to why we're so fascinated with tracking down and seeing these ghosts for ourselves.
Right.
I don't, that's a bunch of questions to throw at you, and I don't
Well,
really
it's
know which
okay.
one I know, but,
Yeah.
but jump with
And
those.
I would turn it around and start from the last question first because I think it's important um, to sort of understand what at least in my point of view, why I'm interested in ghosts. And for me, quite honestly, this was just part of a long time spiritual quest that I'm still in, trying to figure out, like we all do, why are we here? What's our purpose? But more than that, what happens after death? Is there really an afterlife? Um, I'm I'm not a person that buys into the concept of a heaven or hell. But is there some way that we go on in another form? What's that all about? And so that was, for me, it was just kind of curious. Ghosts obviously fit into that. So I have three, let's see, three, four, no, I have four, five. Sorry. I have five books set in American locations. And in all these places, I went to every place myself personally. So that was an important thing. I just didn't want to pull off stories or something from the internet. I wanted to go experience whatever I could experience. Or if I experienced nothing, at least to talk to the people that were there all the time. So as an example, I would go to a haunted hotel, uh, and I would say, so what's the haunted room? And they'd say, well, number 6. Okay, give me number 6. So I'd stay in number 6 overnight, and I would record what happened or didn't happen. But then I'd also talk to the security guards and the desk clerks and the housekeepers and anybody associated with the place who was there every day, because I come in for a couple of hours. Well, you can't get paranormal events to occur on demand.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, um, so if nothing happened for me, I would get their stories. Um, but having said that, so I've had experiences in some locations that uh, defy all the laws that I know of physics and natural science and gravity and whatever. Um, but I don't immediately rush to the conclusion that, well, therefore it must be a ghost, which, I am not a skeptic so much as I approach this as a journalist when I go into these places. So I'm open completely to whatever experience might be there. And in my books, I don't make a case to either defend the existence of ghosts or to negate that and say, they're not real. I leave it up to my readers. And in fact, encourage them to go to these places themselves and see what they experience. But I've had experiences that, like I said, I can't explain. But unlike some of the ghost hunter guys that you see on TV, and I've been on TV with some of them too, who are rabid ghost hunters, and of course are producing a television program. Everything for them is a ghost,
Yeah, I mean, ghosts are money for some of them, so of course
Oh yeah,
everything you're going to see is a ghost.
right.
Yeah.
So they hear a little noise and they, what was that? It must be a ghost. Well, it could be, or it could be a squirrel in your attic.
What were some of these, say, perhaps could you pull out one specific experience for us, for
Yeah,
instance,
sure.
that seemed to defy what should and what should be?
Right. Well, one that really sticks out in my mind was a house in Brooksville, Florida. It's called the May Stringer House, May-Stringer, and it's now the I guess it's Hernando County Historical Society Museum. But anyway, it's an old Victorian home, and it's filled with all Victorian furnishings and antiques and clothing and all this kind of stuff. Well, the home was originally the home of a medical doctor whose wife died giving childbirth in that house. And her daughter, what was her name, Ruby? I forgot. I think it was Ruby, lived to the age of 3, and then she died from scarlet fever or cholera, one of these awful diseases that in the 19th century took so many of us. And, we say, really? We have all vaccines for everything else now. But so she died too. So you had the mother and the daughter both in the house. And the daughter is still believed to be there. So I was actually asked by a docent at this museum to do an investigation there, because she said, we have all kinds of activity here. You wouldn't believe this. And she went on to describe things that she has witnessed. So for one thing, she talked about there was some toys, old, Victorian era toys. And one was a little crib with a doll in it. And it was sitting in the corner of one house, in one bedroom or something. Well, at night they lock up, they set the security system, and they leave. There's nobody in there overnight, of course. So next morning they get up there, they open up, they go into that bedroom, and they find that the crib has been literally torn apart. Like the side pieces are out and everything else, and the doll is thrown somewhere across the room. So they can't understand how that happened. They also had a cabinet of toys that were sort of these solid cast iron models of like steam engines and horse-drawn fire trucks and things like that. They were heavy, solid, and they were in a cabinet. When they came in one morning, they found the toys too were scattered up and down the stairs. They're all over the place. So they had these kinds of things. People had seen figures in the window at night and called the police saying somebody's in there. The police come, they get into the building, they find nobody there. So they asked me to do an investigation there. So myself and a investigator from Tampa, the two of us really pretty much spent the night there. We got there like 8 o'clock or something with this docent. There were 3 of us in the building. And all night long we stayed there with lights out and all that, and just being quiet and going from room to room. And if you've ever watched any of the ghost programs, one thing they always do is they'll get in a room and they'll be very quiet, and then somebody will say something like, is there anybody here that wants to speak to us? They basically address the room.
Yeah.
And, did we get anything? Did you hear that? Or record something on their recorders or something on playback, they'll hear something. So we were doing that kind of thing with no success. It was probably about 4 o'clock in the morning, and we just said, well, there's absolutely nothing happening here. Let's just forget it. And the docent was just so apologetic. Oh, I can't believe it. Every day stuff goes on. We bring you guys in and nothing happens anymore. Everything quiets down. So we decided to leave the building. Now we have to go out through the rear entrance, which is going through this kitchen, set up again as a Victorian style kitchen. So she sets the alarms. Now we're going through this one door. All the lights are off. And we pass, it's a wood burning stove that's right by the doors are going to go out. And on the surface of it, it has this big round iron disc. And it has like an eye bolt attached to it. And attached to that is like this wrought iron handle, probably 18 inches long. And from what I gather, what you would do is when you needed more wood in there, because the stove would be pretty darn hot, you would take this handle, you'd lift up that heavy lid, drop more wood in there, and then put it down. Okay, so this thing is laying completely, this rod is laying completely across the surface of the stove, and it's attached. So we walk by, and there's three of us, and we have one flashlight. And so we're not the best ghost hunters, one flashlight. And all of a sudden, I see out of the corner of my eye, I see this rod. It lifts up, and it lifts up completely. It does a 180. I mean, it lifts up and it flips over, and it does it fast and with violence. I mean, it flips over quickly and it slams down on the surface of this iron stove, and with such great force that it actually pops off the eye bolt that it was attached to and falls on the floor. Now, this is a wrought iron rod, maybe 18 inches long. I don't know, it must weigh maybe 3/4 of a pound or something like that. And we all saw it. All three of us stood there and saw this thing happen just as we started to pass by. And of course, we had our cameras put away. We had our recorders put away. We had no evidence at all, nothing other than what we saw with our own eye. But it was an incredible thing. And we were so amazed that, we picked the rod up off the floor, and we tried playing around with it. Like, well, could we have brushed up against it or whatever? We said, even if we did, we could not have gotten it to rise up and flip over a 180 and with that kind of violence. So we witnessed that. Now, what is that? I mean, that completely defies, again, any natural law that I'm aware of. Does it automatically mean that, well, therefore it must be a ghost? No, it doesn't. But it's certainly a paranormal event, something out of the normal, something above the normal. So, those kinds of things you take notice of. You say, okay, I don't know what that was about, but it was pretty dramatic.
Yeah, that and to see something like that immediate and that concrete and have a chance to kind of explore the item itself rather than thinking you see a form or a shadow and it's passing
Right.
and it's gone, but to actually have it there, that immediate and concrete, that would be quite moving. Do you feel like that has altered or colored your kind of perspective on ghost investigation?
I don't know, Josh. I think to some extent, I think what I tend to believe, it may change tomorrow.
That's a good way to put it. It's like, who
Yeah,
knows what
I
we
think
believe.
I tend, yeah, talk about waffling. I think I tend to maybe, but I do think that there might be some way that that consciousness goes on. I'm not saying necessarily that we go on as beings, but I think of sort of some of the principles in philosophy and Buddhism where you talk about sort of a cosmic mind in a way that we all can kind of tap into. And even there's some studies now being done by some neuroscientists that make the supposition that what we consider the mind might not actually be inside us at all, but it might actually be something outside us that, again, we somehow tap into. And I don't have all the details on this, but it's an interesting thought. So if that's the case, when we die, what happens to that consciousness? Where does it go? I mean, we know that we're energy, right? Einstein said everything is energy. We know that everything is energy. We also know that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. but it can be transformed from one type of energy to another. So we know when we die that parts of us are going to turn into the energy of carbon atoms, and we are literally going to push up daisies somewhere, right? We know that. But is that all that happens? Might there not be something else that happens as well? So many religions have the idea of, spirit, soul, whatever you want to call it, something eternal within us that might go on. And I think that might just have something to do with our consciousness. So getting back to that, could our consciousness or the cosmic consciousness somehow made that thing jump? Maybe. I'm not sure why. I don't know what they or it would get from that, but it may be possible.
That's fascinating, and I'd been kind of only in the very fringes, on the very outside of things, kind of noticing some of those neuroscientific findings and new possibilities that in fact consciousness, which is still a mystery, might very well be from the strange kind of things they're finding, might very well not be created out of the human brain, that the brain might in fact act like consciousness has something to do with it. That's about all we know. but
Right.
that it might actually act like something more like a radio that receives something that transforms into consciousness, that the source might be external, and that's freaky, but so is quantum physics too. And so
Yes.
and,
Right.
but I had never really put together, hearing people like Sam Harris or so like dig
Mm-hmm.
into the science of it. I hadn't really put together that I wonder if there could be any connection between that and ghost phenomena, because it's really hard to it, it's really hard to discount the preponderance of ghost experiences. And yet I'm even ready to doubt my own. And so I'm not even sure what what I've experienced. But that's a fascinating idea to
Right.
meld those two.
Well, and you mentioned quantum physics, and that's one thing I talk about when I give presentations on ghosts, because I've been reading a lot of quantum physics. I don't claim to understand a whole lot of it. It's just mind-boggling, as you know, when you get into it. But if quantum physicists are correct, and there is not a universe, but there is a multiverse, and if there are all these, I don't want to say alternate realities. I don't know exactly how to phrase it. I think that might be one term some people use, but the idea of an infinite number of realms of existence, let's say, all occurring at the same time at the same place, like a big stack of pancakes, sort of. If that's the case, then when we have a ghost experience, when somebody says, "I saw a ghost," is it possible that under some circumstance, and I don't know what that would be, that our world, our reality, literally sort of bumps up against another one, and that we get an insight, a quick couple of second look into another realm, another reality? So what we see as a ghost, is it possible that we're actually just looking at an entity or a being from some other reality? And is he looking at us and saying, "Oh, there's a ghost," just like we're looking at him and saying, "There's a ghost"? I think about that. I think that's, I don't know. It's just another possibility, I guess.
Yeah, and if we're to learn anything from, say, Manly Wade Wellman or H.P. Lovecraft, it's that that's not necessarily good news. And so quit trying to open the door, John. Quit trying to open that door to the evil things lurking on the other side of the
Yeah.
universe.
Yeah. Lovecraft's creeped me out. I'm still thinking about what's going to happen in the future with what he says.
Well, you've been really generous with your time and your experience and your knowledge on this, and so I'm curious if I could maybe, before we find out, where listeners can track you down and find more about your books, perhaps I can hit you with one last two-part question that's perhaps the simplest and the toughest of all.
Okay.
Um, I'm curious what your favorite monster of all time is, and or what monster scared you most as a child.
Wow. What was scary most as a child? I think as a child, um, Frankenstein really creeped me out a lot.
Oh yeah.
Um, and it's funny because he's really such a benign character, really.
Yeah.
In so many ways. Now that I've grown up and read the novel and everything else, I said, well, he wasn't a bad guy. He was misunderstood. But yeah, but as a child, I can remember seeing a Frankenstein and just making grunting and the fire behind them and all that kind of stuff, and that creeped me out a lot. But I think my favorite monster, if you will, um, I think it's probably the vampire, um, and I think there's something. Well, I guess probably the more modern renditions of the vampire too, because they've evolved from something that was really pretty disgusting back in the 1600s,
Yeah.
1500s folklore. Ruddy corpses that would just eat people, but were never shapeshifters or anything. To now they're glamorous, sexy, rich, uh, educated, and some of them get their blood from the butcher shop and don't even get. Um, but I'm fascinated with the whole idea of the vampire, especially when there are communities too today that call themselves sanguinarians, and truly believe that they need human blood to live, and have actual donors that give them blood under very hygienic conditions, as if you're donating blood. But there's communities in Buffalo, New York, and New Orleans, and I don't know where else. So that whole idea, I think that's my favorite. There's just a lot of unpacking there still. And again, like I say, the evolution of the vampire has been quite interesting, especially as a
Yeah.
shapeshifter.
Yeah, the vampire gets to be like the catch-all monster. It gets to be the beast. It gets to be the undead. It gets to be like the warlock or the witch sorcerer. It gets to be sexy. It gets to be scary. It gets to be everything at once. I think.
Right,
Yeah.
right. The
Well,
ultimate shapeshifter.
yeah. Well, this has been a really cool conversation. And for those listeners curious to find out more about you and check out your books, and find out where you're speaking next, where should they go online to find out more about you?
Sure. Well, the easiest thing is to go to my website, which is johnkachuba.com. So it's JOHNKACHUBA.com. My schedule is up there of all the events, that I'm doing. I have a blog up there. I have my books are available there, but also my books are pretty much available anywhere. They're hopefully still in some bookstores, mostly independents, but they're on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all those places online too. So they're easily gotten.
Yeah, and for everyone listening to this, down in the description on whichever platform you're listening to it on, you can find a link to John's website there. And so once again, you've been so generous with your time and your knowledge. And it's been a very cool conversation. So thank you so much again for joining me here on The Monster Professor, John Kachuba.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed it myself. Great.